We cannot repay evil for evil.
Shipwrecked, beaten to the brink of death, hunted by his own people, betrayed by friends, imprisoned and tortured, all for a message of hope. This is the story of a man who endured the unthinkable and never gave up. This isn't just a story from the past. It's the unbelievable life of the Apostle Paul, a man whose faith in Jesus carried him through the harshest trials. And what you're about to hear will change the way you see hardship forever. If you think you know Paul's story, think again. His struggles were far more brutal and far more inspiring than most of us realize. And the horrible way he died will leave you jaw-dropping. And before we get started, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss more historical and faith-based content like this one. Plus, you can join this big family of Christians and historians by visiting our website at historyguy.com. In addition, we have a Facebook page now, also as History Guy. Let's connect there and continue to spread the good message. Now let's dive in. Apostle Paul was one of the most extraordinary figures in the Bible and one of the most influential individuals in the history of Christianity. His life is a vivid testimony to the power of God's grace to transform even the most hardened hearts. Born as Saul of Tarsus, Paul's journey from a zealous persecutor of Christians to a devoted apostle of Christ stands as one of the most inspiring and captivating stories of redemption ever told. His impact on the early church is unmatched, as he was instrumental in spreading the gospel beyond the Jewish community, establishing churches throughout the Roman Empire, and writing letters that now form a significant part of the New Testament. To fully appreciate his influence and what led to his death, we need to understand not only the events of his life, but also his character, challenges, and the world in which he lived. Paul wasn't merely an apostle by title. He was a man driven by the conviction that the message of Christ was worth any price. His letters reveal a heart that beat for the gospel and a mind deeply rooted in both Jewish tradition and the revelation of Jesus Christ. Through his words and actions, Paul challenged people to rethink their understanding of God, sin, salvation, and community. Paul's story begins long before his encounter with Christ on the road to Damascus. Born as Saul in Tarsus, a major city in the Roman province of Cilicia, modern-day Turkey, Paul was raised at the crossroads of two cultures, Jewish and Greco-Roman. His Hebrew roots ran deep. He was born into a devout Jewish family from the tribe of Benjamin, Philippians 3:5. And from a young age he was trained in the strict teachings of the Pharisees, a sect committed to preserving the law of Moses. Paul's parents ensured he was educated in the Jewish scriptures, and his upbringing was filled with traditions, prayers, and a deep love for the Torah. Yet, being born in Tarsus also exposed Paul to the wider Greco-Roman world. He was not only a Jew, but also a Roman citizen by birth, an advantage that would prove crucial in his ministry and legal battles later in life, Acts 22:25-29. This dual identity gave Paul a unique perspective, allowing him to navigate both Jewish and Gentile communities with ease. His knowledge of Greek philosophy and Roman customs enabled him to communicate effectively with people from different cultures, making him a masterful bridge between worlds. Paul's formal education continued under the renowned Jewish teacher Gamaliel in Jerusalem, Acts 22:3. Gamaliel was a respected Pharisee and one of the most influential scholars of his time, known for his balanced and thoughtful interpretation of the law. Under Gamaliel guidance, Paul became well-versed in the scriptures and developed the skills to engage in rigorous theological debates. His zeal for the Jewish faith grew, and he became fiercely committed to defending the purity of Judaism against what he saw as dangerous influences, chief among them the followers of Jesus. Before becoming an apostle, Paul was a man of intense passion and conviction, but his passion was misdirected. As the early Christian movement began to spread, Paul saw it as a threat to the Jewish faith he cherished. He viewed the followers of Jesus not just as heretics, but as rebels who needed to be stopped. With unwavering determination, Paul set out to crush the movement. He became one of the most feared persecutors of Christians, going from house to house to arrest believers and have them imprisoned. Acts 8:3. Paul wasn't content with merely opposing Christianity. He sought to eradicate it. His zeal knew no bounds, and he traveled far and wide to hunt down followers of the Way, the term used for early Christianity. His approval of the stoning of Stephen, the first Christian martyr, shows just how committed he was to his mission. Acts 7:58-8:1. To Paul, these actions were a service to God, a way of purging false teaching from Israel. But even as Paul fought to destroy the church, God had already marked him for a different purpose. Paul's intense zeal, intelligence, and ability to engage with diverse communities were qualities that God would use once they were redirected by grace. A shocking encounter. Paul meets Christ on the road to Damascus. Paul's journey to faith began with one of the most dramatic encounters in the Bible. On a mission to Damascus to arrest more Christians, Paul's life was interrupted by a divine confrontation. As he approached the city, a blinding light from heaven stopped him in his tracks, and he fell to the ground. Acts 9:3-4. In that moment he heard the voice of Jesus saying, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" The words must have hit Paul like a thunderbolt. In an instant, everything he thought he knew was called into question. The very man he'd been persecuting, the crucified Jesus, was alive, speaking to him from heaven. For 3 days, Paul remained blind, overwhelmed by what had happened. During this time, he neither ate nor drank, grappling with the reality that his life's mission had been built on a terrible misunderstanding. God sent a believer named Ananias to visit Paul. Though initially fearful of meeting such a dangerous man, Ananias obeyed God's command and laid hands on Paul, restoring his sight. Scales fell from Paul's eyes, symbolizing the spiritual awakening taking place within him. Acts 9:17-18. Baptized and filled with the Holy Spirit, Paul emerged from this experience a changed man. His old identity as Saul the persecutor was gone. He was now Paul the Apostle, a servant of Christ. The story of the Apostle Paul is not just history, it's a breathtaking adventure. It's the tale of a man who began as a fierce enemy of Jesus, but was transformed into one of the faith's greatest champions. This isn't just about one man's journey. It's about how God's power can completely change a heart, use the most unlikely person for his purpose, and spread hope across nations. Paul's life is full of drama. Imagine being known as someone so feared that Christians whispered your name in dread. That was Saul of Tarsus. A devout Pharisee with an iron will, Saul believed he was doing God's work by hunting down followers of Jesus. He dragged men and women from their homes, had them imprisoned, and even approved of the death of believers. Acts 7:58-83. Saul was determined to stamp out this new Jesus movement before it could spread any further. But God had other plans. While on the road to Damascus, a sudden flash of blinding light threw Saul to the ground. In that moment, everything changed. He heard a voice calling out to him, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" Acts 9:4. It was Jesus, the one Saul thought was dead. Blinded and helpless, Saul was led to Damascus, where for 3 days he sat in darkness, wrestling with the truth. His world had been turned upside down. A believer named Ananias was sent by God to visit Saul. Though hesitant at first, Ananias laid his hands on Saul, and something like scales fell from his eyes. Acts 9:18. Saul could see again, both physically and spiritually. He was baptized, and from that day on, Saul became Paul, a new man with a new mission: to tell the world about Jesus Christ. Paul's first steps, early ministry and escape from death. Paul's journey wasn't smooth from the start. As soon as he began preaching, he stirred up trouble. He boldly declared that Jesus was the Messiah, challenging the very beliefs he had once defended. His sudden transformation left people confused and suspicious. Was this some kind of trick? Could they trust him? In Damascus, the Jews plotted to kill him for preaching the gospel. Acts 9:23-25. Paul had to escape for his life. His friends lowered him in a basket through a hole in the city wall under the cover of night. Paul knew from the beginning that following Jesus wouldn't be easy. When he reached Jerusalem, the believers there were still afraid of him. It was only through Barnabas, a trusted leader, that Paul was accepted by the apostles. Barnabas stood beside Paul, assuring them that his transformation was real. But once again, opposition arose. Jewish leaders wanted Paul dead, and he had to flee Jerusalem for safety. For a time, Paul returned to Tarsus, waiting for God's next step. Even in these early days, his life was already marked by danger and rejection. A mission like no other. Paul's 3 great journeys. Paul's passion for spreading the gospel took him far beyond his homeland. Over 3 incredible journeys, he traveled thousands of miles across the Roman Empire, preaching the message of Christ in cities, synagogues, and marketplaces. Each journey was filled with both thrilling victories and crushing trials. The first journey, opening new doors. Acts 13-14. Paul's first journey began with Barnabas, traveling from Antioch to Cyprus and then to cities like Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe. They preached to Jews first, but many rejected their message. Undeterred, Paul and Barnabas turned their focus to the Gentiles. In Lystra, Paul performed a miracle by healing a man who had been crippled since birth. The crowd was so amazed that they tried to worship Paul and Barnabas as gods. But the mood quickly changed. A mob turned against Paul, stoned him and left him for dead outside the city, Acts 14:19. Remarkably, Paul got back up and continued preaching. It was clear, nothing would stop him from sharing the gospel. The second journey, reaching Europe, Acts 16-18. Paul's second journey was even more ambitious. He revisited the churches he had planted earlier and then crossed into Europe, becoming the first to bring the gospel to the West. In Philippi, Paul and his companion Silas were arrested, beaten, and thrown into prison, but instead of despairing, they sang hymns to God in the middle of the night. Their worship triggered a miraculous earthquake that shook the prison doors open. Acts 16:25-26. The jailer, amazed by what had happened, asked Paul how he could be saved. That night, the jailer and his entire household were baptized. Acts 16:33. Even in chains, Paul's ministry flourished. The third journey, strengthening the churches, Acts 18:23-21:17. Paul's third journey focused on deepening the faith of believers. He spent 3 years in Ephesus, a major city, preaching and performing miracles. So many people turned away from idol worship that the local craftsmen, who made statues of the goddess Artemis, started a riot, worried that their business was in danger. Acts 19:23-27. Paul's work in Ephesus was powerful, but it also stirred up fierce opposition. Despite the challenges, he continued to teach and encourage believers, knowing that the gospel must take root even in the hardest places. Paul's life was marked by constant hardship. He was beaten, stoned, thrown in prison, and shipwrecked multiple times. 2 Corinthians 11:23-28. Yet through every trial he pressed on. He faced hunger, sleepless nights, and betrayal from people he trusted. Still, Paul found joy even in suffering, believing that nothing could separate him from the love of Christ. Romans 8:38-39. One of Paul's most dramatic experiences came when he was shipwrecked on the way to Rome. Stranded on the island of Malta, Paul survived a deadly snake bite, which amazed the islanders, Acts 28:3-6. Even in the midst of disaster, Paul's faith never wavered. Paul's letters, building the church through words. Paul's letters, or epistles, make up a large part of the New Testament. These letters weren't just theological essays, they were personal, heartfelt messages to churches and individuals. In them, Paul tackled difficult questions about faith, grace, salvation, and Christian living. His letters to churches like the Corinthians and Ephesians guided believers on how to live out their faith in a world full of temptation and challenges. His personal letters to Timothy and Titus provided encouragement and advice for young leaders navigating the challenges of ministry. Even while imprisoned, Paul continued to write. His letters served as lifelines for believers, helping them stay grounded in the gospel. The final chapter. Paul's arrest, imprisonment, and martyrdom. Paul's ministry was fearless, bold, and relentless, and eventually it made him enemies in the highest places. His preaching of Jesus as the Messiah stirred up anger among the religious leaders in Jerusalem. Wherever Paul went, crowds gathered and often riots followed. The Jewish leaders accused him of breaking the law, stirring up rebellion, and defiling the temple. Acts 21:28. They viewed him as a dangerous threat, not just to their authority, but to the delicate balance between Jewish tradition and Roman power. Paul knew the risks of going to Jerusalem, yet he went anyway, determined to preach the gospel there. In Acts 21, he was seized by a mob in the temple, accused of bringing Gentiles into a sacred space. The crowd dragged him outside, and they would have beaten him to death had Roman soldiers not intervened. Acts 21:30 through 32. Paul was arrested, not because he had done anything wrong, but to calm the chaos and protect him from the angry crowd. Imprisoned in Caesarea, 2 years of waiting and witnessing. After his arrest in Jerusalem, Paul was transferred to the city of Caesarea, a Roman stronghold on the coast. There, he spent 2 long years imprisoned, Acts 24:27. During this time, he stood trial before Roman governors, including Felix and Festus, as well as King Agrippa. These trials were full of intrigue and drama. Paul, with his keen mind and sharp arguments, defended himself against the false accusations of the Jewish leaders. He didn't just defend his innocence, he boldly preached the gospel to everyone present, including the powerful Roman officials judging him. In one trial before King Agrippa, Paul gave his personal testimony, recounting his dramatic conversion on the road to Damascus. The king was deeply moved and even said, "Do you think that in such a short time you can persuade me to be a Christian?" Acts 26:28. Paul's words were powerful, but despite his compelling defense, the political situation was complicated. Governor Festus, wanting to please the Jewish leaders, kept Paul imprisoned. When Paul realized that he wasn't going to get a fair trial in Caesarea, he exercised his right as a Roman citizen and appealed to Caesar himself, Acts 25:11. This decision set in motion a journey that would take him all the way to Rome, the heart of the empire. The journey to Rome: storms, shipwrecks, and survival. Paul's journey to Rome was anything but easy. He was placed on a ship with other prisoners, guarded by Roman soldiers. But as they sailed, a violent storm struck, and the ship was tossed for days on the open sea. Paul, though a prisoner, emerged as a leader in the crisis. He reassured the crew, telling them that God had promised they would survive the storm. Acts 27:23 to 25. After 2 weeks adrift, the ship finally wrecked on the island of Malta. Miraculously, everyone on board survived, just as Paul had foretold. But even on Malta, Paul's challenges didn't stop. As he gathered firewood, a venomous snake bit his hand. The islanders were convinced that he was cursed and would soon die. Yet Paul shook the snake off into the fire and suffered no harm, Acts 28:5. The people were astonished, and they began to believe that Paul was someone special. Paul stayed on Malta for 3 months, healing the sick and sharing the gospel. Eventually, another ship took him to Rome, where his next chapter awaited. Under house arrest in Rome, a ministry without walls. When Paul finally reached Rome, he was placed under house arrest. Though a prisoner, Paul was allowed to live in a rented house with a soldier guarding him, Acts 28:30. His chains didn't silence him. Instead, they became a platform for the gospel. Paul welcomed visitors from all walks of life, Jews, Gentiles, and anyone curious about his message. He preached with boldness, teaching about the kingdom of God and the salvation found in Jesus Christ. Paul's ministry flourished even under arrest. He couldn't travel, but his words reached far and wide. He wrote letters to the churches he had planted during his earlier journeys, letters that would become some of the most important writings in the New Testament. Among these were the epistles to the Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon. In these letters, Paul shared profound insights about faith, grace, love, and perseverance, encouraging believers to remain steadfast in their walk with Christ. Despite the limitations of his imprisonment, Paul's spirit remained unbroken. He saw his chains not as a curse, but as an opportunity. In Philippians 1:12-14, Paul wrote, "Now I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel." His imprisonment became a testimony to the power of God, showing that nothing could stop the spread of the good news. The final trial, facing death with faith. According to tradition, Paul's ministry in Rome lasted around 2 years. During this time, he continued to write, preach, and encourage believers. But under the reign of Emperor Nero, things took a dark turn. Nero's hostility toward Christians grew, especially after a great fire destroyed much of Rome in AD 64. Seeking someone to blame, Nero turned his wrath on the Christians, initiating a brutal persecution. Paul, as one of the most prominent leaders of the Christian movement, was arrested once again. This time, it was different. The tone was more severe, and the outcome was clear. Paul's time was running out. He was no longer under house arrest, but imprisoned in harsher conditions, likely in the cold and dark Mamertine prison, awaiting his final trial. Even in these grim circumstances, Paul's faith remained unshaken. He knew that his death was near, but he did not fear it. In his final letter to Timothy, Paul wrote these stirring words, "I have fought the good fight, I have finished the race, I have kept the faith." 2 Timothy 4:7. Paul saw his life as an offering to God, poured out in service to the gospel. The martyrdom of Paul, a crown of glory. Tradition tells us that Paul was condemned to death and taken outside the city of Rome to be executed. As a Roman citizen, he was spared the gruesome fate of crucifixion. Instead, he was sentenced to be beheaded, a quick and decisive death. The image of Paul kneeling before the executioner with his head resting on a stump is a powerful one. It captures the final moment of a life devoted to Christ. The sword came down, and Paul's earthly journey ended. Yet for Paul, death was not the end. It was the beginning of eternal life with the Lord he had served so faithfully. Paul's death was not a defeat, but a victory. He believed that to die was to gain, for he would be with Christ, Philippians 1:21. His martyrdom was the crowning moment of a life lived fully for the gospel. In that moment, Paul's race was complete, and he entered into the joy of his master, a legacy that lives on. Paul's death did not mark the end of his influence. His writings continue to shape Christian theology and inspire believers across the world. His letters teach us about God's grace, the importance of faith, and the power of perseverance in the face of trials. His life challenges us to live boldly for Christ, no matter the cost. Paul's story is not just a story of suffering, but of triumph, a triumph of faith, grace, and love. He began as a persecutor, but ended as a martyr, pouring out his life for the cause of Christ. His legacy reminds us that God can use anyone, no matter their past, to accomplish great things for his kingdom. In the end, Paul's arrest, imprisonment, and martyrdom stand as a testament to the unstoppable power of the gospel. His chains could not silence him, and his death could not defeat him. Paul's life and his death remind us that the message of Christ is worth everything. Let us know what you think about Paul by commenting down below. Thanks for watching.